After our next speaker, there's going to be a short period for questions and answers. So to ask a question, please go on your phone to futureready.socialqa.com. Click on the red Ask a Question button, and then type your question and hit Submit. We may not get to all of your questions, but we're going to do our very best. It is now my pleasure to introduce someone who first spoke to the Future Ready Iowa Alliance members at our kickoff meeting about why this work is so very important. Please welcome Mr. Brandon Busteed, Executive Director of Education and Workforce Development for the Gallup organization.
Thank you. Good morning. It's good. It's a decent start. I'm not going to ask you to do it again. I realized, though, that I needed to start by thanking all of you for my job. No Iowa, no George Gallup. No George Gallup, I'm not here today. So thank you, Iowa. And I also want to say thanks to Governor Reynolds and to the leaders, the K-12 superintendents, the business leaders, the college presidents who have been involved for many years now in building what, in my mind, is easily the most productive ecosystem of employers and educators at a state level. So huge kudos to the work that's been going on. Absolutely. I want to talk through the lens of Gallup's research about a new vision for American education. Some of this might not sound very new because aspects of it are about getting back to our roots. But it's a vision about how work and education might merge. And we can think about this in a lot of different ways. I want to start, though, by where we are right now in the world of education. And as we think about important goals of having our education system at both the K-12 and higher ed level align to producing graduates who go into meaningful work and have meaningful lives, we have to think carefully about what it is that we measure. Many of you have heard this expression in some form: we are what we measure. A question I have for all of you is, are we actually measuring all the things that we value? Because those are two very different things, as I'll explain throughout my short time with you this morning. Start right now with how we measure the success of students and teachers and schools and colleges and universities right now. And I want to be very clear about this. These metrics that I have on this slide are incredibly necessary, but in and of themselves, insufficient for understanding how well we're doing. You think about what the great rankings of colleges and universities that are out there do, and they take essentially input measures of students from high school before they have matriculated. They put them into a formula, put a lot of weight on things like their incoming test scores, what their grade point average was in high school. They put that in a formula and they say, here's the best colleges and universities in the country. But see, that's based on inputs, not outputs. If you wanted to know which were the best colleges and universities in our country based on the learning, growth, and development of students from when they matriculate to when they graduate, wouldn't that be a nifty way of thinking about it? We have no idea who's doing well on that because we're not systematically measuring that growth and development over that time. Now, we do have output metrics like graduation rates of colleges, GPA. Here's a good one for you that I mention often, but the average GPA in higher education has gone up 1.1 points in the last 30 years. So if you go back, those of you who graduated roughly 30 years ago, just add 1.1 to your GPA. I mean, you know, a 2.3 is a 3.4. A 2.9 is a 4.0. I mean, so my question to all of you is, are we going to use these metrics alone to determine our success, or are we going to think about adding to these a broader set of indicators that give us an idea of how things are going? In many respects, a lot of these things don't have direct alignment with workplace outcomes or things like Gallup measures, whether people end up engaged in the work that they go into. So see, I want to measure whether somebody gets a job, and I want to measure how much money they make in that job, but I also want to measure other qualitative aspects of that work. whether you like what you're doing. That was actually a theme in the video here earlier this morning. Whether you're doing things that you have a chance to do what you're best at each day. These are examples of the qualitative aspects of work that make it either come to life for you or kind of make it a job where you're going through the drudgery of the day-to-day tasks. Now, we also have to get the premise right. You say, what do people want out of higher education? It doesn't matter what kind of group we've surveyed. General population of U.S. adults, parents of 5th through 12th graders, college freshmen, as UCLA does through their famous SERP survey. The good news is Americans value higher education for a number of reasons. It's not singular. But the top reason they value higher education is a very, very clear number one reason, and that is to get a good job. So in simple terms, if we're not measuring the degree to which graduates get a good job, we're missing out on some of the key indicators of success. So how are we doing? Most of our data actually points more to a broken link between education and work output, probably more so than we would expect it to. And it starts with very different perceptions of how we're doing. So this is not a perfect apples-to-apples comparison, but in 3 separate surveys we've done, one of college provosts, one of the general population of U.S. adults, and one of C-level business executives, you can see that they have very different confidence levels in how well we're doing in preparing college students or college graduates for success in the workplace. Now, I don't know how much of this gap is perception versus reality. I think it's a healthy mix of both, but these are important things for us to grapple with. And oh, by the way, I even think we agree very quickly on certain things that we actually don't agree about. I'll give you an example. Critical thinking. Everybody says, yes, we want students to be critical thinkers. But then if you dive deep and you start asking people questions about what do you mean by critical thinking, we start to hear very different answers from employers than we do from academics. So although we agree about this idea of critical thinking, we have different definitions about what we mean. And that might all be part of one broad spectrum of the type of thinking that we want to encourage. But see, business leaders will talk more about creative thinking or original ideas and thoughts. Academic leaders will talk more about critical thinking in the sense of taking an idea and trying to pick apart the various aspects of it that don't seem to hang together. Now, those are all important aspects of thinking, but again, although we agree on the general terms, there's disagreement underneath the surface. And you say, okay, how are college graduates doing in getting a good job? Well, we went out and asked them. This is the largest representative survey of college graduates that's been done. And we asked this of recent college graduates. These are college graduates, all college graduates nationally in the last 10 years. And what you can see is that when you ask them a question about how long it was before they landed a good job, you start first with the 27% who said they had a good job waiting upon graduation. There's another 22% in here who weren't looking for a job because they went on to graduate school. So if you kind of take that group out of here, about a third of all recent college graduates took 7 months or longer before they landed a good job after graduation. Now, I don't need to tell you about the rising costs of higher education, right? But amidst the backdrop of that, a 400% increase in tuition since 1980, and the backdrop of $1.4 trillion in student loan debt, $1 trillion of which has been acquired since 2003 alone, you can start to see why it becomes a really important indicator to know whether graduates feel they're getting a good job and how long it takes to launch. Now later, I'll tell you how you can double that percentage from 27 to 54%. There's a really simple lever. The path forward, I believe, based on all of our research, requires, pun intended, real work. And so let me give you examples. This is a study of young Americans looking at various aspects of their education. And what was interesting is this was a study about 21st century skills and whether they experienced those during their education. We tested all kinds of different questions, and it turns out there were 2 that double the odds that these young Americans are successful in their work after graduation. And they were things like whether they said they worked on a long-term project that took more than a few classes to complete, and whether they were able to apply what they were learning to some sort of real problem in their community or the world. This is about hands-on education. This is about relevant education, and relevant not just to a job or career, but relevant to, let's just say, your day-to-day life. If students can't experience that relevance and apply that, we're missing a huge opportunity. Now, as we look at just pure reports of whether they have any kind of work-related experiences, these are students nationally in grades 9 through 12. You can see less than 5% say they're currently interning in any form with a local organization. Less than 5%. Only 17% report that they've worked an hour or more in a paid job. So as work experiences go, very few students in our education system today are touching any of those. They're not touching them in large percentages in the classroom, and they're certainly not touching them in large percentages outside of the classroom. But you say, Brandon, what's the number one thing that employers want from college graduates? And it's a simple answer. A student who's had a job or an internship experience. And interestingly enough, 85% of them would trade a B student with an internship over an A student without one. So they're not saying they don't value grades. They do value grades, but they're willing to trade a whole grade point for a student with a work experience. And that's a really important message for all of us in the audience today. One of the other interesting things we dug up recently, just in the last few months, we asked U.S. adults, as one of the largest survey projects we have going on now, we're interviewing 350 people a day as part of the Strata Gallup Education Consumer Pulse. 350 people a day, ask them about their educational experiences. This is people who have no high school degree, high school only, some college no degree, all the way up through postgraduate. Representative sample of the U.S. population. And it turns out when we asked them about where they got their advice for college or what to major in, and we asked them about the helpfulness of that advice, that the top-rated advice comes from the least used source, which are employers. So graduates who got their advice about what to major in from an informal source, somebody who's in a job, right, an employer, somebody that they worked for, they say that advice was more helpful than any of the other advice sources that we tested, including the lowest rated source of advice, formal counseling sources. Now, there's opportunity here, right, because it doesn't say, well, geez, the high school guidance counseling system isn't working, but it does say, how can we integrate employer-driven advice and guidance as part of that process? And there's so many different ways that we can do it. Right now, it's happening almost entirely informally as opposed to formally, yet it's the most valued form of advice. We also dug this up just 2 weeks ago. Among currently enrolled college students, we found a strong linkage between their overall well-being and the career relevance of their education, which is a fascinating point. So when we looked at the top drivers of college student well-being, the number one driver was a statement about whether they felt they had a chance to do what they do best each day in school. And we were interested in what the drivers of that feeling were, right? So those who say, yes, I have a chance to do what I'm best at each day in school, what is it that drives that? And it turns out those top two answers are career relevance statements. They say things like the knowledge and skills I'm learning in my coursework is going to be relevant in the workplace, and that they have had some sort of conversation with faculty and staff and a feeling that the faculty and staff there support their career development and getting them to a place where they have a rewarding career. Now, what I'm going to do is share with you the ingredients of college that makes for the most successful graduates. So again, now I'm back to the largest study of college graduates in U.S. history, in looking at the factors that they experienced or didn't during college that are linked to their success later in work and life. So these first three items that I'm going to share with you are what I call having a relationship-rich experience in college. And I'd like all of you to take this little quiz. These were all statements to which people had an opportunity to say 5 strongly agree to 1 strongly disagree. And I'm interested, raise your hand as I say these statements if you strongly agree, if you'd give that a 5 in thinking about your own college experience. You guys ready for this quiz? Okay, here we go. The first one is you strongly agree that you had at least one professor who made you excited about learning. How many of you say 5 strongly agree to that? Solid work. My guess is 80% of the audience just raised their hand. As you can see, nationally, 64% of college graduates strongly agree to that one. Now, that sounds like a pretty high percentage until you realize the bar on that one, which was just 1. And you flip it around and say almost 4 out of 10 didn't have a strong feeling about that. Now, the next one is a little more broadly worded, right? The professors at your alma mater cared about you as a person. How many of you strongly agree to that one? Oh, about half the hands from the previous question. And you can see nationally, about 27% of college graduates strongly agree to that question. The next one is the most strongly worded and the rarest in terms of those who hit the mark on it. How many of you strongly agree you had a mentor who encouraged your goals and dreams? Oh, that's a pretty good number in this audience. I'd say about 35% of you just raised your hand. That's about double the national average. 2 out of 10 college graduates strongly agree. And for all of those of you in the room who just raised your hand, what was the very first thing that went in your head instantly? There was no hesitation in your answer. A name of a person, their face, maybe even a couple people, instantly came into your head. And it doesn't matter if you were 22 or 62, you answered that question instantaneously. To me, it speaks to the power of the connections that can be made between students and mentors, whether those are faculty, other staff, sports coaches. These are things that have a lasting relationship with your workplace engagement and your well-being later in life. Because if you strongly agreed to any of these three, it doubles the odds that you're engaged in work and thriving in your well-being across your lifetime. Just think about that for a minute. Now, the next 3 items I'm going to share are what I call more work-integrated or experiential in nature, and see how you score on these. These also double the odds that you end up engaged in your work, whatever that work might be. They have a little relationship with well-being, so they're not quite as strong as the first 3, but from work engagement perspective, they're equally as powerful. So the first one is, and this is going to sound similar to the research I shared earlier on high school graduates. You say you worked on a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. How many of you strongly agree to that in thinking about college? Not bad. The problem is it's less than a third of college graduates nationally that strongly agree to that, which is pretty stunning to me. These other 2 questions were sorting questions because we asked a similar question. We asked, did you have a paid job during college? If you say yes to that question, it has no relationship with anything. But if you said you had a job or an internship, this is the key part of the phrase, were you able to apply what you were learning in the classroom? That's the key indicator. Doubles your odds of being engaged in work later. And the last one, too, is a sorting question. We asked a long list of items that you could have said yes to in terms of extracurricular activities, but separately we had a statement about whether you felt you were extremely involved. Now, here's why I say this is so important. You look on the far right, and you can see that only 3% of college graduates strongly agreed to all 6 of these things. Another 24% on this end didn't hit the mark on any of them. And only about 23% hit the mark on 1. So about half of all college graduates in the United States are a 0 or 1 on this critical 6-question scale that I just gave you. The difference in saying that they felt well prepared for life outside of college is a 17x differential. On the one end, 5% of those college graduates strongly agree they were well prepared for life outside of college. And on the other hand, it's 85%. Keep in mind that everybody in this data set met the academic requirements for receiving a diploma from their institution. But the difference in the quality of that experience is truly night and day. So if we don't start getting under the hood and measuring some of these qualitative aspects of education and work, we're in real trouble. But this is all doable, because I would argue we haven't really made an effort to do that yet. But if we start to ask different questions, tougher questions of our performance, questions of students about the relevance they see or not in their education, questions of teachers about pushing them to think about how they can integrate project-based learning and work examples in the classroom, measuring the outcome of graduates, so we're not just measuring did they get a job, but what kind of job and the qualitative aspects of that work. These are all things that if we start to do, I am confident we can improve on them very quickly and in very dramatic fashion. So I will now end my comments and open it up to Q&A.
Okay, so the first question we have is related to rigor. Since rigor of courses and study is shown to be an indicator of future success, how do we connect rigor with real work?
Well, I think I mean, in many ways, it's a simple answer, right? I don't think that rigor and real work are mutually exclusive. And in fact, those things usually go hand to hand. You think about a long-term project, for example. This might not even require an internship, but a long-term project where it took a semester or more to complete. Usually that's a project where you work on something, you get feedback, you make some iterative changes. Many times those are examples where you work in a group with a team. It could still involve very serious academic rigor in terms of analysis that might be involved or whatever it might be. But I think the question is a difficult question to answer because I don't see those things as mutually exclusive. I think they're one and the same.
You had a study that showed that 27% of recent graduates have good jobs upon graduation. Do you know what the other 73% would say?
Well, in the data, right, we can go back to that slide if you'd like. The percentages who report having a good job later, it was just more time that it took them to get to a good job. So 2 months or less, 3 to 6 months, 7 months to a year. So it's a delay in how long it took for them before they said that they had a good job. You can see 16%, it took 12 months or longer. It's interesting. When I share this data with boards of trustees of colleges and universities, they are incredibly concerned about this data point. Their feeling is that 27% should be much higher. But I mentioned there's a way to double that. Students who said they had an internship where they applied what they were learning in the classroom, the connectivity between work and education, 54% of those graduates had a good job waiting upon graduation. So if you just want to double that, there's your answer. Make sure they had an internship experience where they applied what they were learning in the classroom.
The new vision for American education will take sustained engagements from stakeholders across many sectors. What promising practices in support of this vision have you observed, and who tends to lead those efforts?
Well, leadership can come from any angle. It can come from students themselves and redesigning their own educational experience. It can come from the teachers in their own classrooms. It can come from principals and superintendents at a school level or a district level. It can come from employers who say, hey, I want to work with you, college or university or school district, to come up with a different type of talent development pipeline. It can come from parents, moms and dads who are fed up with the current system and see a different angle. Here's the idea. We all can play a role in this. And I think the most important initiatives that I've seen are ones where people from different sectors in this kind of conversation come together. So my compliments about Iowa being highly organized between employers and our K-12 system here and the higher ed institutions. That's an incredible advantage. There's already a lot of great examples of successful partnerships happening as part of that. And just clarifying some of the goals and the communication and the opportunities there. I know it sounds simple, but I know many Fortune 500 CEOs who have never met with a college or university president, and vice versa. And it's not just the large employers, but think about all the small and medium-sized employers. To what degree are we having even a conversation with one another about what we're looking for? Or to what degree are we talking to students about whether they're excited about what they're doing in school, whether they have a chance to have creative learning opportunities? There's just so many ways to do this. So I think it starts with having honest conversations with one another. But the good news is I see great examples all over the country. The problem is we need to bring them to scale. And part of our systems right now in terms of what we're measuring is one of the things that's preventing us from taking it to scale. We're not measuring any of the key indicators that I've mentioned here. We're just not. We're not measuring any of that at a systematic level. How do we think we will start improving on those things if we don't start to measure those things? Thank you.
So if you could look into the future, let's say 20, 25 years down the road, what do you envision post-secondary training and education will look like, and will we do a better job of integrating business with education in the future?
Yeah, I don't think we have any choice. We have to, right? I think the concept of higher education is going to look like something more that's attached to our hip throughout our lifetime, as opposed to something that we do in a defined 4 or 2 year period in a concentrated fashion. What I mean by that is that, you've seen some of this data, right? The average graduate today is supposed to go through something like 9 to 11 different career changes in their lifetime. How is that going to be possible if you aren't coming in and out of higher education in various forms, right? And not just in the accredited ways that we think of now as a 2-year or 4-year program, but in bits and pieces. Coding boot camps are good examples, right? I get retrained relatively quickly in something. I go back into the workforce. By the way, something changes in the workplace. I need to get retrained. We're all going to be in a constant flux of that. So if employers aren't thinking about how they help develop and grow employees for themselves, and if educational institutions aren't thinking about how they can be more nimble and allowing people and encouraging people to come in and out of higher education in various ways, we're going to miss the boat. So one of the challenges is going to be reforms to accreditation as well.
Are there any states or education systems you would highlight as leaders in asking or analyzing these qualitative questions?
Not yet, unfortunately. There's
Kids
plenty of opportunity for Iowa to lead the way.
There you go. Amen. Kids start to feel like in school doesn't matter in middle school. Do you have any recommendations on how we can apply the information you've given us to talk to students at an earlier age?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we have in education at all levels is, I'll just oversimplify this, and I made the point earlier, it's about relevance. And relevance is not the content we teach, okay? Because you could teach philosophy and make it incredibly relevant to somebody's life, the decisions that they make, the decisions that they're seeing across the world, right? So it's not a content issue, it's a pedagogical challenge in terms of how we teach the content we're teaching and how we apply it to things that make it relevant for students. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. One is to figure out the things that students have interest in, right? So great teachers, they're very good at things like individualization. They walk into a classroom and they want to know what makes every individual student tick differently. And if they find out that I like sports cars, they frame my math questions around sports cars. That's a simple but starting place around making education relevant, is that you're attaching it to something that gets my attention or makes me excited. But I think the big challenge we have across the education system is showing students at all levels how what they're learning matters to them, to their lives, to the world, and we can do that in any content subject. It's not just STEM. STEM, obviously, we can see more ready applications of project-based learning and certain things like that. We might need to stretch ourselves a little bit more in other subjects, but not really. And so it's not just a STEM conversation. I think it's relevant to all the content we teach. I think it's much more important to think about how we teach that content, why that content matters to the student, and that's where we'll make some great breakthroughs.
Okay, one last quick question. Do you believe that if teachers had more opportunity for internships and externships, that would help strengthen the connection between businesses and academia?
Yeah, so I love the idea of teacher externships. I love the idea of faculty externships at the higher ed level. Anytime we can give smart, bright teachers exposure to the kinds of things that are happening in the workplace, they will bring that back, those insights back, and find ways to integrate them into the things they're teaching in the classroom. So I'm a huge fan of that. I think one of the things we need to do for both students and teachers is give them more control over how they teach, and in many ways, what they teach. You think about the average time for a student in school right now, ask yourself, how many minutes of their day in school do they have time to create their own learning, right, where they have blank canvas time? How much time do we give for teachers to do the same thing? And I think we've taken a lot of the creativity and empowerment away from teachers. I'll leave you this really, really horrible statistic. I'm sorry to end on a bad note. But teachers in the United States are dead last among all professions in saying that their opinions at work count. It's just an example of a teacher corps that feels relatively disempowered compared to other jobs. And so that's one of the things that we really need to focus on and fix, is the degree to which we're empowering teachers versus forcing certain things on them. So that will help certainly as it relates to their connectedness and the relevance they can bring to students as well. Thank you all for the terrific work you're doing. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning.